Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, I'm David Kramer here with your Alaska weather. As always, please visit our website at weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for the state. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Starting off, we'll take a look at our warnings and advisories that we have out for the state. Quite a few out, especially in the more northern locations. We'll start off in the western locations, however. Starting with St. Lawrence Island, we have a winter storm warning out for the island, and that is going to be in effect until 6 a.m. on Thursday, and that is for snow and blowing snow out there with blizzard-like conditions. We also have a coastal flood advisory out that's going to be in effect from 3 p.m. Wednesday until 9 a.m. on Thursday for the island. Along much of the rest of the west coast, we have winter storm warnings out for all the way from the Yukon Delta area up through western parts of the Brooks Range, and those are going to take effect midnight tonight and go into around 6 a.m. on Thursday. Then we have the Brooks Range, both the southern side with winter storm warnings and the northern side with winter weather advisories. All of those are for snow and blowing snow and are in effect now, and they're going to be going into Thursday morning until around noon on Thursday for some of those more eastern locations. Down in the central part of the interior, winter weather advisory for snow down there. That's going to expire on Wednesday morning at around 6 a.m. And then we also have winter weather advisories for snow and blowing snow for the Alaska Range. Moving on to some of the more southern locations, we'll take a look at the only watch that we have out, a winter storm watch that's going to be in effect for Thursday night for high winds around the Bristol Bay area. And then we have a winter storm warning out for the Susitna Valley area, and that is out until around 9 p.m. this evening for snow. Moving on to our satellite imagery so we can see what's causing all of this. We'll start off with the main low pressure center that's up towards the northern part of the Bering Sea. It's starting to push towards the Bering Strait area. And as we watch this again, we can see the front with this system draping through much of mainland Alaska, pushing from west to east, bringing up a lot of flow from the south, a lot of moisture. We can really see that being funneled up from the south towards areas all along the state, and even with some more moisture coming in behind that and some more cold air continuing to bring snow to much of the areas along the west coast and snow throughout mainland Alaska, including south central locations. And then one more time, we'll look way out to the west as we have another system coming in from the west, bringing some precipitation to areas around the western Aleutian Islands. So we can see now for the remainder of the day what we have going on. That system way out west a little bit warmer, bringing in some rain to the western Aleutian Islands. But out ahead of that, throughout all of the Bering Sea, that westerly flow bringing in snow showers to areas around the Pribilof Islands and down towards the Aleutian Islands. However, right by the Aleutians, a little bit warmer there. Going to see more rain, especially as we get towards the Pacific side. That old front that we had now starting to trough out, but is still bringing in a lot of moisture, a lot of snow throughout much of mainland Alaska, including some blowing snow along the coastline is going to be expected throughout the Brooks Range as we saw, and even some areas along the Alaska Range. Northern sides of the Brooks Range is not going to see quite as much snow, but still going to see a fair amount compared to that southern side of the Brooks Range where they're going to get the majority of the snowfall, but still a lot on the northern side as well, and some blowing snow conditions up there. Along the coastline is going to be a little bit lighter up there, but still some snow expected later in this evening. Interior part of Alaska seeing a lot of snow there as well, but as we get down into the Panhandle area, high pressure dominating, keeping most of the showers away. Just some light areas of rain showers just off the coastline near Sitka. As we move into the nighttime hours, we are going to have a weak low spinning up there just north of Yakutat with a weak frontal system bringing in some more precipitation to areas along the Yakutat area, along the coast for the Gulf Coast and the northern parts of the Panhandle area. Primarily snow, but as we get by the water a little bit warmer, it could be some rain out there. Snow still for areas in the eastern part of Prince William Sound, and it's still going to see continued snow throughout much of the night for much of the interior, a little bit stronger as we get further out to the west, and we are going to continue to see those blowing snow conditions throughout tonight all along the west coast and through much of the Brooks Range. However, along the coastline, snow starting to stop, but could still see some areas of light blowing snow with the winds up there, but not as much new snowfall for those locations. Our other low pushing into the Bering now, bringing up warm air all the way to the Pribilof Islands, rain behind that warm front all the way down through the central Aleutians, but we have some colder air coming in behind, bringing some snow showers back to the western Aleutians. As we move into Wednesday, that low now pushing up further towards the Bering Strait area, bringing that warm air up from the south up towards St. Lawrence Island. Not quite there. Should still be snow around St. Lawrence Island up by Nome area and Seward Peninsula areas. And we can see that tighter pressure gradient bringing in those stronger winds continued through much of Wednesday along the west coast, bringing in those blowing snow conditions with even some new snowfall behind that warm front. Not quite warm enough yet to see that transition over to rain, and then some snow along the Brooks Range. Heavy winds there still, bringing in some blowing snow conditions throughout the Brooks Range, and some more areas of blowing snow along the Arctic coastline, even though not expecting a whole lot of new snow, but some of the snow that's already on the ground with those strong winds could get blown around and drop visibilities with that blowing snow. Behind this frontal system, we do have some colder air coming in, bringing in some lighter snow showers out over western parts of the Bering Sea, and a weak low by the western Aleutians, bringing in some more snow over those locations. Southern parts of the Gulf, we have high pressure starting to build in, and then we have some weaker showers out over some of the southern parts of the Panhandle and more interior locations as we start to get to the more landlocked areas. South central location is going to start to see the effects of that high pressure building in, not as much in terms of precipitation, but some isolated snow showers, especially up by the Talkeetnas. Then on Thursday, high pressure really building in over the eastern part of the state, clearing out the Panhandle area, south central area, much of the central and eastern parts of the interior, with even some fog forming in the Copper River Basin area. But we have our newest low coming into the southern part of the Bering Sea. Huge influx of warm air bringing rain through the Alaska Peninsula, Aleutian Islands, and up in towards St. Lawrence Island area. But along the coast, still going to be cold enough to see primarily snow with some blowing snow conditions all the way up towards western parts of the Brooks Range. West of our main low pressure, we are going to have some colder air bringing in some snow to those locations. For our temperatures, starting with our lows for tonight, we do have temperatures dropping down into the mid-30s for the Aleutian Islands, dropping down below 30 as we get to the Bristol Bay area, up along the west coast of the state, dropping down into the mid-20s. But as we get along the Arctic coastline, dropping down into the single digits for some areas like Barrow and Kaktovik. But as we move down into the interior part of the state, especially western places of the interior, only down into the 20s. Eastern locations dropping down to as low as -3 at Arctic Village. So you get down into the south central, just below freezing for most locations. Golcana a little bit lower, 12 degrees expected low there. Into the mid-20s for the most part along the Panhandle, with some of the southern locations staying a little bit warmer. Wednesday afternoon getting up into the mid-30s throughout many locations along the Panhandle. Again, a little bit warmer. Further to the south, getting up into the lower 40s there. Just above freezing for many locations around south central Alaska, getting up to 20 for Golcana, up to 39 degrees for Kodiak. Up into the mid-20s for many locations in the interior, getting up into the teens for a lot of the more eastern locations. Let's get up into the Brooks Range, into the teens there as well, and then up into the 20s all along the Arctic coastline. As we get over to the western part of the state, Kotzebue Sound area right around freezing, just above freezing for the Norton Sound area, with Gamble getting up to 32 degrees, expected high Wednesday afternoon. Mid-30s throughout the YK Delta area, down into Bristol Bay, and right around 40 degrees for the Aleutian Islands. Taking us to Wednesday night, Thursday morning lows into the mid-20s for the Aleutians, into the mid-30s as we get closer towards the Alaska Peninsula. Mid-20s all along the Bristol Bay and YK Delta coastline, all the way up through the Seward Peninsula as well. And then along the Arctic coastline, expecting temperatures to drop down into the teens. Arctic Village should drop down to around -1. Most locations in the eastern part of the interior into the single digits, but western locations going to stay in the 20s. Into the teens for many locations around south central area, with Golcana dropping down to -5. Kodiak only getting down to -28 for a low. And then in the mid-20s for the most part for the Panhandle, southern locations staying a little bit warmer there. Thursday afternoon highs expected, mid-30s for much of the Panhandle, a little bit warmer in the south, continuing that trend. Into the south central locations, mid-20s for the most part, warmest along the North Gulf Coast, mid-30s there. Up in the interior part of the state, into the teens for eastern locations of the interior, western locations, mid-20s, mid to upper 20s all along the Arctic coastline expected. Kotzebue Sound area into right around freezing, Kotzebue getting up just above freezing at 33 degrees. And then just at freezing for all the way around the Norton Sound area, right around freezing for the YK Delta area as well. Mid-30s for the Bristol Bay area, 40s for the Alaska Peninsula, and mid-30s for the Aleutian Islands, with shimmy out there at 31 degrees expected high for Thursday afternoon.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Taking a look now at our aviation forecast, we'll start off with our flight weather charts. Starting Wednesday morning, we have an area of IFR conditions coming up with the frontal band out over the southern parts of the Bering Sea up near the Pribilof Island and St. Matthew Island as well. As we move over the main part of the state, we do have some areas of MVFR conditions spreading up of much of the Norton Sound area, up the rest of the west coast with some areas of IFR through much of the Brooks Range, central and western parts, and then some MVFR conditions along the Arctic coastline. Western parts of the Alaska Range also going to see some IFR conditions, and then as we get closer towards the Wrangell-St. Elias area, we will see some IFR conditions there as well, and down by Yakutat with some MVFR conditions in the northern parts of the Panhandle. As we move into Wednesday afternoon, we are expecting those conditions to slide further south in the Panhandle area, now covering the southern areas of the Panhandle and more of the inside waters, starting to get into inland locations there. Some areas around the south central from the Anchorage area up to the central part of the Alaska Range, MVFR conditions expected. Northern parts of the interior through much of the Brooks Range, MVFR conditions expected there as well. As we get further to the west, we are going to see some IFR conditions, and that's going to stretch through St. Lawrence Island, down through the middle parts of the Bering Sea, and through the central Aleutian Islands as well. Then as we look at Thursday morning flying weather, MVFR conditions through much of the Bering Sea with some areas of IFR in there as well. Up through the Brooks Range area, some MVFR conditions expected. As we move to south central, just some isolated areas of MVFR, and in the Panhandle, in the southern locations, isolated areas of MVFR there as well. Thursday afternoon, Panhandle is going to clear up much of the mainland part of the state and central and eastern parts, just some isolated areas of MVFR expected. But for the Bering Sea and along the west coast of the state, widespread MVFR and IFR conditions expected Thursday afternoon. Taking a look at our passes, AKwx will be IFR, improving all the way to VFR as well as Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start down at IFR, improving to VFR conditions, as well as Rainy Pass. Windy should be VFR throughout the day, whereas Isabel should be MVFR throughout the day. IFR conditions expected to start off for Mentasta, improving to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Tanita Pass should be MVFR throughout the day, as well as Portage. And Chilkoot and White will both start off IFR and then improve to MVFR later in the day. So look at our freezing levels. Surface freezing level going right along the North Gulf coastline. We do have an area of warmer air extending up towards Kodiak Island and then going up the surface freezing level through the northern part of the Bering Sea. Taking a look now at our icing, starting off over the Bering Sea, we have between 1,000 and 5,000 feet in the southern areas of the Bering Sea, but as we push towards the YK Delta area, between 2,000 and 5,000 feet there. Above 4,000 feet as we get to the Seward Peninsula, extending up along the Arctic coastline as well. As we move to more interior locations, above 6,000 feet expected there. Above 5,000 feet as we drop down towards the Copper River Basin area, and then for the Panhandle, between 1,000 and 5,000 feet expected. Taking a look at our jet stream, moving out over the southeastern part of the state, a southwesterly jet component, 120 knots there. Strongest portion of the jet, however, off to the west, 205 knots, but as it gets over the Aleutian Islands, dropping down pretty quickly to around 115 knots there, and then 80 knots over the southwest coastline. Then as we drop down to 9,000 feet, we do have winds out of a westerly direction over the western Bering Sea, anywhere from 25 to 35 knots. As we drop below the Aleutian Islands, we do have winds up to as high as 45 knots out of a southwesterly direction. But our main core of winds here up to as high as 75 knots out of a southerly direction, pushing right through the central Bering Sea out towards the Bering Strait area, then dropping down to around 55 knots, extending out over the Brooks Range area, westerly direction around 40 knots there, Dropping down as we get further to the south, and as we get to the south central area, westerly flow around 25 knots. And then on the other side of that strongest corridor winds up along the Arctic coastline, we do have winds 30 to 25 knots up there. Over the southeastern part of the state, southwesterly flow around 40 knots expected at 9,000 feet. Down to 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow, primarily westerly flow out over the Panhandle area, 10 to 20 knots expected, but right off the coastline there, we do have winds a little bit stronger circulating around, our high pressure around 35 knots. But our strongest core winds is in a similar location to higher up at the 9,000 feet level. We do have 75 knots here at 3,000 feet extending through the central Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea, and then dropping down to around 45 knots as we get through the Bering Strait area. Westerly flow 20 to 25 knots as we get further to the west. Turbulence as expected with those stronger winds below 4,000 feet along all the Aleutian Islands, and then over the west coast of the state below 5,000 and 6,000 feet with some isolated areas of severe for the Seward Peninsula.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
The Space Weather Prediction Center has had a long-standing relationship with the power industry, so they've been aware that solar storms, the geomagnetic storm piece of that, can affect the operation of their systems and induce extra currents and loads on those systems that can either trip those systems offline or in the worst of cases, cause damage. That relationship goes back for several decades. In fact, a big incident in 1989 where part of Quebec was tripped offline that affected something like 6 million customers for about 9 hours. I think that really raised the awareness in the power industries.
When we get the alert, we watch the grid and start looking for issues. Are we seeing a decline in voltage? Are we seeing equipment failures? And we readjust the system to try to mitigate those problems, try to keep the lights on and keep it from going out.
Averaging about 500, 550 kilometers per second.
If we didn't have this early warning, we wouldn't see it until our sensor saw it. Getting more information quicker and faster before the storm hits, not during the storm, is a big improvement.
In the long term, I think what we need and what we're moving toward, the U.S. as a whole, is better modeling, fully understanding this phenomenon, understanding how it would impact specific systems.
Rather than actually experiencing a storm, we can simulate storms in our software and see what the impact is. We try to get ahead of it. We always plan that if there's an outage, how can we keep the lights on? What's the best process to prevent it?
In the end, 5-10 years from now, there's going to be a whole mix of operational procedures driven by what we do on prediction and warning. And then there also will probably be some level of hardware controls to ensure the reliability of the grid.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
There's different types of impacts on communication systems, and the HF we call the high frequency, which is that band of communications 3 to 30 megahertz. But it's a very important band of radio communication because it's used widespread. It's used, for example, by the airlines.
HF radio is most commonly used for position reporting when you're going across the ocean airspace, which is devoid of radar. And ATC can't see you, so it's up to you to report your position and your altitude and your speed.
HF works great most of the time, except during a big flare. And during a big flare, that HF communication capability could be gone within a minute or two. So as soon as we see something happening in there and we see a flare, it's one of the first things we do is alert the aviation community, hey, big flare, HF's going to be impacted.
Once we know that there's an event going on, then the aviation industry and the airlines can react to that. They can alter their routes over the poles. They can lower the altitudes that they're flying at, or maybe decide not to fly at all in the interest of the passenger safety.
So that's just one example of how HF is used, but the emergency response community will use it a lot too. It's one of their primary backups.
When you've lost connectivity between certain government agencies, it gives you that long-range coverage to talk from out-of-state to federal governments or from the FEMA locations to the state emergency operations centers.
So if you've got a big hurricane impact in the coastline, whatever big city, we've got the cell towers down and whatnot, we've got emergency communication folks in there. Those folks are very familiar with space weather and how it impacts their systems.
Here in recent years, it was used during Katrina when we had a lot of communications outages down there. It was also used during Hurricane Ike. There was an outage of the telephone circuits with the Texas State Emergency Office, so it was used in both of those situations.
So when we talk about backup, especially for the airlines, typically they'll have SATCOM, so it'll be satellite communication.
The satellite technology that emergency responders use could be GPSs, could be satellite phones, satellite data terminals.
Space weather events can impact SATCOMs. The impact can range from a nuisance to loss of a spacecraft. So we will give them the heads up. If we have space weather events, flares, whatnot, they need to know what's impacting their systems. Situational awareness is key. Time is of essence to these folks. Again, it's life and death.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. We'll take a quick look at the Marines and we'll start off with the ice edge now. Our ice does go down the west coast of the state, down into the YK Delta area, past Nunavik Island there. But as we are going to see a lot of southerly flow bringing up a lot of warm air over the next couple of days, we are expecting a lot of melting along the west coast and in areas up through the Bering Strait towards the Point Hope area. However, a little bit further to the east in the upper parts of Cook Inlet, we are seeing some new ice growth, primarily from Fire Island North, and that's going to continue as long as temperatures stay below freezing. For our main part of our marine forecast, we'll start off in the Panhandle area. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, we have primarily westerly flow, 20 to 25 knots there. So we move into the inside waters, a weaker flow around 10 knots further to the south, but as we get up north of Juneau, we do have southerly flow around 20 knots with gusts to as high as 35 on Wednesday. As we move into Thursday, flow becoming more northerly, 15 to 20 knots in the inside waters, and then southeasterly flow, 20 to 25 knots out over the eastern parts of the Gulf. Taking a look now for the south central area, southwesterly flow through the Cook Inlet corridor, around 25 knots there, seas as high as 8 feet in southern parts of Cook Inlet. As we look out over areas of the Gulf here, westerly flow, 20 to 25 knots, getting stronger out to the east, around 30 knots there, and in Prince William Sound, 20 knots. Seas as high as 9 feet. And then as we look into Thursday, flow becoming more easterly, and we have in Prince William Sound 15 knots there, 25 to 30 knots in the northern parts of the Gulf. But as we get closer towards the Barren Islands, strongest flow there around 40 knots out of an easterly directions, with seas as high as 16 feet west of the Barren Islands. In the Cook Inlet area, 20 to 30 knots, strongest as we get further to the south, and that is out of a northeasterly direction. On Wednesday for the Alaska Peninsula, primarily southerly flows here in more of the western locations. Strongest out to the west, around 40 knots there, but as we get further to the east, dropping down to 25 knots. And then westerly flow around Kodiak Island, 15 to 20 knots there, with seas as high as 10 feet. As we move into Thursday, flow becoming much more easterly and a lot stronger for areas on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula. Storm force winds as high as 55 knots there, with seas as high as 25 feet. For Shelikof Strait, easterly flow 40 knots there with 10 feet for seas. And then on the Bering side, a little bit weaker, but still pretty strong. Easterly flow 45 knots there on Thursday. As we look out over the Aleutian Islands, west to southwest flow 30 to 35 knots out over the western part of the Aleutian Islands. But as we get towards the central and eastern part of the Aleutians, we see that strong southerly flow, and you can see the image in the background there. Again, that is for seas, showing that strongest core of seas here right between, or just to the east of AKwx. And we are seeing winds, storm force again here, southerly flow 50 to 55 knots, seas as high as 29 feet just south of AKwx. And then as we get further to the east, dropping down to as low as 35 knots out of the south. Then on Thursday, we are going to see more of a westerly flow, 35 to 40 knots, a little bit weaker, until we get by the eastern Aleutian Islands, southeasterly flow, 35 to 40 knots there. Then way out west, we have northwesterly flow, 40 to 45 knots, seas up to as high as 23 feet. As we look along the west coast of the state, primarily southerly flow, again, really strong winds here up to around storm force at 50 knots. Highest seas, 29 feet by the Pribilof Islands, and then along the coastline a little bit lower there, 16 feet expected. As we look into Thursday, flow becoming a little bit weaker and out of a more easterly direction, 35 to 45 knots, strongest south of Nunavik Island. As we get up towards the Bering Strait area, southeasterly flow 30 knots there. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're seeing primarily southerly flow right by the Bering Strait around 50 knots, but as we get north of the Bering Strait, gale force winds around 35 knots there, and then 25 knots as we get up along the Arctic coastline. For Thursday, 30 to 40 knots, strongest as we get further to the west, up to as high as 45 knots by Point Lay area. Down by the Bering Strait area, southerly flow around 35 knots. Quick recap for the state. We do have several warnings and advisories out primarily for the interior and west coast of the state. If those are your locations, please check the website weather.gov/ARH. You can get any updates to the forecast through that means, and we can see different timing in areas, but we do have a lot of snow coming into the interior part of the state tonight. And we also have some stronger winds, especially along the west coast through the Brooks Range areas. We are going to see a lot of blowing snow and snow falling in those locations. Down as we get further to the south, a little bit more warm air, bringing in some rain to the Bering Sea and central Aleutian Islands. And then way out east, we do have some snow for south central and for the northern parts of the Panhandle. We are going to see that snow continue for the interior and along the west coast as we move into Wednesday, still seeing those stronger winds. So again, we do have several winter storm warnings out for those locations for that blowing snow and snowfall. And then we still are going to see some blowing snow along the Arctic coastline. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.